Hello everyone, I'm Rebecca from Untitled Stitchery. I'm here today with a different type of video than usual, but it is one that you'll probably see more of going forward. Those of you who know me in person know that recently I left my job to just start pursuing art on a more full-time basis. So you're going to be seeing more from me in the future in terms of how many videos I put out because I have more time. But also I'm going to be getting my shop open. You're going to see my finished goods, hopefully dyed yarn, all that stuff. In addition to that though, many of my relatives are resellers. So what they do is they go to local thrift shops and yard sales and freebie barns and they search through everything and they find stuff and then they, flip it online, and that's how they make their living. And I was thinking it'd be cool for me to go with them sometimes and look at it from more of like a crafter's perspective and just sort of show you what I pick up, what my plans are for it, all that stuff. So yesterday I went to a local Goodwill with my sister and I didn't get a huge amount of stuff, and I unfortunately didn't get any footage in the store because well, let's just say my nephews weren't cooperating, but I can show you what I got, and then I also have a topic to talk about relating to thrifting sweaters specifically. So we're going to be looking at that. But these are the two things I got. Let me make sure I'm in frame. Yeah. All right. So these are both going to be for me, but they're just interesting enough that I wanted to show them off. So I love terrariums. I have, let me think, 4. They're not all finished. I use them to like display little figurines and different setups and poses, more like a diorama type of thing. And the ones I have, they're not alive. They're made with preserved fern, preserved lichen, I think it is. Anyway, this is interesting because if I do it right and it works, it'll actually be alive. So, and this was $2. Now, what annoyed me when I got it is when I tried to pick it up, I tried to pick it up by the handle and this cover does not stay on. So there is that, but it has bits of moss and lichen and some little fake mushrooms. Those are actually pretty cute. Well, these might be foam. I have some ceramic ones I can replace. And we got some dirt and some rocks and some, I forget what this stuff's called. My brother will probably send me a message correcting me because he is very good with plants and he knows what all this stuff is called. And then we got some little fern seeds, and there's all sorts of instructions in here. So I'm gonna probably give that a shot because I love houseplants. I think I've shown you some of my houseplants before. They're even bigger now since I moved. They've like really expanded. That's not all gonna fit back in there. But I just love the idea of growing my own little fern garden in a jar. So I got that. And then I also got this. So I had heard of these before, but I didn't really know much about them. I just knew they were kind of expensive. And I saw this for $5 and I was in a hurry because of my nephews. So I couldn't really open it in the store, but I was like, ah, okay, that looks cool. So I bought it, $5, it's not too bad. And it was new in the box. Everything's still wrapped in plastic. But what it is a mug that goes on a little heating thingy and it keeps your coffee or tea warm. There's a little lid as well, like a steeping lid. I just think it's so cool. So you will probably see this in some future sips and stitches and sips and shuttles, because I think it'd be really nice if I'm working on a project to set that up on my desk and get my tea started, and then as I work it'll just make the tea for me, right? I think. I'm not actually sure it gets hot enough to brew tea. It might only keep it warm, so that'll require some experimentation. So yeah, those are the only things I bought. I did look at the sweaters, but I didn't find anything. So I pulled a sweater from my stash of sweaters so that we can talk about this, because this is something that I'm going to be doing more often and it is worth talking about. So one way that you can get really nice luxury yarns for a much cheaper price is by Upcycling Sweaters. Now, this particular sweater here is alpaca. As far as I can tell, it's pure alpaca. And this is quite a lot of it. I mean, this is, it doesn't have a size on it, but I think it's a large. So that is a lot of yarn. And I'm pretty sure when I bought it, or when my mom bought it, I can't remember now. Sometimes when she has more of them than she needs for her business, I end up taking some off her hands. So this one might have been from her. But I'm pretty sure it was from the $6 sweater rack. So $6 for all of this. Alpaca yarn is usually quite a bit more expensive than that. So I have a list of what I personally look at when I'm looking at sweaters on the rack, and that way I can tell which ones are worth my time and worth bringing home. And if you want to try doing this, then you'll know as well. So first things first, find the fiber content. On this one, it's easy. It's right here. But on most sweaters, you're going to have a fiber tag somewhere in this part of the garment. Usually, if you were wearing the sweater, it would be on your left side seam. So looking at it, it would be on your right side when you're looking at it on the rack. However, it can occasionally be on the other side. It's almost always that seam though. So I personally do not use acrylic yarns. Almost never anyway. Occasionally I'm given some and then I try to use them up just so they're not wasted. But if I'm going to be putting all the effort in to unravel a sweater, then I need to make sure that the fiber content is worth that amount of time. So for me, I only get them if they are, you know, superwash wool, merino, alpaca. Sometimes I'll do cashmere or angora. Those two are a lot more difficult, which we will discuss in a second. But mostly alpaca. My dream is to someday find a vicuna sweater. I know they exist, and actually one was found in a thrift store not too far from me at one point. It was a big deal in the reseller community, which is why I know about it. But I've never personally seen one. I did find a guanaco one once. That was cool. All right, so fiber content is first. Second thing I look at is the wash instructions, which most of the time are either on the back of the fiber content tag or on a tag right around here. I'm mostly just looking at that if it is a wool or merino sweater, because sometimes I'll find a superwash wool or superwash merino sweater, and that would be interesting to use for making things like socks and stuff like that. If I'm, for example, spinning yarn for socks, and I had a couple thin plies of a superwash merino from a sweater that was machine spun, I could add that in for extra stability. So those can be useful in that respect. And it's also just important to know what you're dealing with. If it says to only, what is that called? Dry clean it, and it has been dry cleaned, then it tends to have like a powder to the yarn. And then as you unravel it, that powder gets in your nose and it's very unpleasant and probably bad for you. So there's also that. I usually do, if it says dry clean only, I'll do like a field test to see if it feels like it has that residue, and then I'll probably avoid it. That happens a lot with cashmere. All right, the most important part, to me at least, that you check is the seams. Now this one has the correct seams, and I'm gonna try and lift this up so you can see it. But they're just little stitched seams. And then there's another type of seam that looks kind of like a crochet, line of crochet. That's fine too. This one just looks like a running stitch, which is interesting. But sometimes you will find serged seams, which is like, oh, do I have anything near me that's like that? Because I don't, how do I explain a serged seam if I can't show you what it looks like? Let's see. That serged? No, but I can use it to demonstrate what I mean, I think. So, if this was serged, it would have, here's the seam, and then it would have loops going back and forth around it the whole way down. And usually, if a piece of knit fabric is serged, then it is also cut. And if it's cut, you can't unravel it because you would just get a lot of individual lines of yarn. It's also incredibly difficult to undo serged seams. it's really not worth your time to even try unless you are buying it for felting, in which case it does not matter. But for unraveling it into yarn, you want either the like crochet stitch looking seams or a really basic running stitch, just anything that you know you can pull apart easily. Yarn thickness, most of the sweaters you're going to find in the store are going to be thread weight. So cashmere and merino, and like merino silk, cashmere silk, those sort of blends, almost always thread weight. And that's not the end of the world, but if you are looking at a, let's say, size small sweater or even a vest, and it's thread weight, even after you unravel it, once you start doubling up the yarn so it's a usable, workable thickness for you, you're really not going to get that much yarn. So was it actually worth it to you to buy that sweater and put hours into unraveling it? Probably not. Probably not. So that is also something to consider. This one seems to be about worsted weight, maybe DK. Yeah, I'll say DK. It's not quite worsted. But that's a really good thickness, and I know I can work with that. You're going to want to look at the condition of the sweater. So if it has a lot of pilling, that is something to consider, because pilling means that the yarns themselves have lost some fibers and have lost some strength. So usually if you're going to see pilling, it's going to be under the arms. You'll see it a lot in the front as well, but under the arms is where it is most common. And especially with cashmere and Angora sweaters, if there's pilling, I don't want it, because by that point, since those fibers are already so small and fine and hard to work with, if there's a lot of pilling, I'm not going to be able to unravel the sweater. It's going to fall apart as I try. And then you're just left with a huge waste of fluff, just disintegrated. Overall condition, if it has any stains. Stains are not always a deal breaker for me, especially since I can over dye them, but sometimes, depending on the stain, it can damage the yarn around it to the point where it's not as usable. For example, some types of stains kind of weaken the fabric, and then you would lose some of the yarn. But yeah, stains are not necessarily the end of the world, but they are something to look for. Holes, if it's a pull hole, like it got snagged on something and ripped, and you can tell that looking at it, then it's not a big deal. If it looks like maybe a moth ate the hole, you don't want it. Leave it there. At that point, you could be introducing something into your stash that you don't want there. And a lot of people, even if it didn't have any holes, they will take it home and freeze or treat the sweater to make sure they're not bringing anything into their stash that they don't want in there. All right. I mean, finally, after all of that, the only thing left to check for me anyway is the price. I usually think about how much it would cost me to buy a skein of a similar yarn and how much effort I'm willing to put into unraveling that type of yarn, and whether or not it balances out to be worth it. This is quite a few skeins worth of really decent alpaca that I plan on dyeing. So this was definitely worth it. If this was thread weight alpaca, it would probably not be worth it, because unraveling thread weight alpaca would make me want to tear my hair out. But this should unravel very well. So yeah, that's all the type of stuff that I look into. And then after that, the only thing left to do is to turn the sweater inside out and start taking it apart. So I'm gonna show you, or at least try to show you, because it's not always a straightforward process. A lot of times, even though the fabric itself was made by a machine, a lot of the finishing work is often done by humans. So they're not always logical in how they're put together. Now usually, make sure I'm in frame. Yeah, usually where I start is under the arms, because that is where the most pieces meet and I can see relatively well what I'm doing. Now, as you can see, the arm is a separate piece, seamed all the way around from the rest of the body. And not a seam ripper. You can do it with scissors, but it's much easier with a seam ripper. We're going to look through and try to find a thread that looks like it connects the pieces together. I think it's this one. Now, it's pretty easy to mess up the corners, in which case you'll have breaks in your yarn when you're balling it up. This is not the end of the world. It just means you'll have more joins. But I think I got the right one. It's I'm gonna give that a pull, and then the whole thing starts to come apart. Now this one, because it is 2 colors, it's going to have multiple sections to unravel, because as you can see, the colors are carried as you go. So there is that to keep in mind as well. If it's a color work sweater, it's gonna probably be more work. Also, if it's like, what is that called? That type of pattern where it's all the diamonds. I can't remember what it's called, but it's a very popular type of sweater. And those are horrible to unravel because there's so many different colors going and they're just joined in really weirdly usually. So unless it's something really precious and you're sure that you want it, it is not worth it. So I'm just gonna go through and keep doing this. Like I said, this one's a running seam instead of the crochet stitch looking seam. If you get a crochet stitch looking seam, you can usually get a hold of it and then literally just pull the whole thing out and it undoes itself. So those are by far the easiest seam. This one's not terrible. But it's just gonna go down the whole arm like that. And then up here, we have the other part of the sweater, and you're gonna do the same thing. You wanna find the seam instead of snagging any of the yarns from the actual sweater so that you can keep the lengths as nice and long as possible. I usually just kind of pull it apart, try to find the one that doesn't look like it's part of the stitch. All right, I think I see it right here. And try not to snag anything else. And like I said, you will usually see the most pilling under the arms too, so even if the rest of the sweater is nice, sometimes in the arms, under the armpits, you will find some pilling, which I am seeing a little bit of fuzzing at the seam corners under the arms, which is why I'm bringing that up. But we got the seam going, now we can just keep pulling that one the whole way around. And then we also have, of course, the one here that goes down the body of the sweater, but that one was the same strand, so it's already going. So yeah, I'm just gonna pull all these out. I'm gonna go into time lapse, and we're gonna get this broken down into panels before the next step. Hopefully my neighbor's noises in the background aren't too loud, but we ended up with 4 panels from this one. That's honestly a lot better than what you normally end up with. So when you take apart a sweater, I'm gonna sit back down, sorry. All right, so when you take apart a sweater, especially if they're machine made instead of made by a person, there tends to be some weirdness in construction. For example, if you have a sweater that has ribbing, then the ribbing section is almost always a separate piece of fabric that was then stitched on. So let's say you had a button-down cardigan with ribbing at the neck, both sleeves, and the bottom. You would have two front panels, at least 1 ribbing panel for the neck, 2 sleeves, 2 ribbing panels for the sleeves, the ribbing at the bottom, and did I already say the back? I can't remember. And then of course the button bands, which would be 1 or 2 panels themselves. So that is a lot of individual little panels. So that's something to keep in mind when you're picking sweaters for unraveling. The more complex the sweater is, the harder your job's gonna be. So we have these panels, and one thing that you tend to notice as you take apart sweaters to use the yarn is that they are very rarely a solid strand of yarn. So in this case, it looks like it's 2 strands of fingering weight held together for the entire sweater. I've had other sweaters where it's like 6+ strands of thread weight. So depending on what you plan on doing with the yarn, it could be something that you need to think about. If you are hoping to dye the yarn, then scanning up a bunch of held together thread weight bits could be a recipe for disaster, because they could get really tangled in the dye process. So you might want to consider dyeing them in more of like a sock blank style when they're in the panel form. That can be less risky, and then you just unravel them into yarn after you're done dyeing them. You just have to be careful not to felt them, of course. So I'm just trying to get this started. Most of this I'm going to unravel during my leisure time, so just sitting in front of the TV, it'd be a good time to do this. I just wanted to get it started. Since this is 2 colors, I'm going to end up with multiple balls of tan and multiple balls of white. So each panel, I'll hopefully have 1 ball of tan and 1 ball of white, but there's 4 panels, so that's, you know, 8 individual balls of yarn. Now this yarn's unraveling fairly well, but especially with alpaca and anything hairy, you're going to want to be pretty careful as you unravel it, because they tend to stick and you don't want to break the yarn more than you have to. There will occasionally be moments where you'll find a part that's particularly pilled or delicate and the yarn breaks. That's just something that happens. But if you pay attention when you're picking your yarn in the first place, you can be, you know, picking the sweater in the first place, you can try to avoid ones where that's going to happen. So that helps. All right, so there's 1 stripe of tan. And this is a fairly long process. So anything you save on in money, you are paying for in time. And also the yarn's going to be kind of wavy because it was in knit form for so long. It's just kind of ramen noodles looking. That's normal. Some people will wash and stretch the yarn, but if I'm going to be dyeing this yarn anyway, which I plan to, then I'm just going to wait and do that during the dye process instead of getting it wet twice. And I'm pretty sure this has not been dry cleaned. It doesn't have that weird crunchy texture, so I'm not particularly worried about that. So yeah, this is unraveling really well. Nice smooth unravel. It's not catching on anything, but it is going to change colors every few rows, which is going to get annoying. Which is, if it was a solid piece made of 1 color, I could just hook it up to the ball winder and have that do most of the unraveling for me. But since it is changing colors every few rows, it makes more sense to do it by hand. So yeah, that's about it. I'm just going to keep doing that until the whole sweater's unraveled. Usually when I'm storing them, I'll put them in a bag with the tags, and then the tags are the label, so I remember what the yarn was. Some people will like tape the tags to the bag so they can keep everything together. As long as they stay together, that is probably sufficient. But no matter which way you look at it, it is financially a much cheaper way of getting more luxury type yarns, even if the time expenditure is pretty high. Right now I have more time than money, so I can put the time in. And you shouldn't feel bad about unraveling stuff that you bought at a thrift store, especially in the off season. Like right now it's too warm for these sweaters to even really be selling. So most of them, if they end up out on the floor, are just going to be sent to the bins. And then from the bins, if they're not bought out of the bins, they're sent to the landfill. And just, I mean, who's going to be buying a super thick wool sweater in the middle of, well, end of spring or the middle of summer? As we get closer to fall, it's different. But even then, like, there's some of the thrift stores around here, they will mark stuff down at the end of the month. So if it didn't sell within the first month, it goes to the end of the month rack. And then from there, if it doesn't sell off the end of the month rack, it goes to be, what do they call it? It's like a big pallet of stuff. And then that pallet of stuff basically goes to landfills, I guess. I mean, there are circumstances where it gets sent somewhere else first, but most of the time it just doesn't get held on to. It gets wasted. So why would you feel bad about saving something from being wasted if you're going to be making it into something else? I don't know, that's just my 2 cents on it. I'm certainly not, what would the phrase be? I don't want to lecture you. But personally, I would rather use something than let it be wasted, especially if it's alpaca. So yeah, I'm going to work on unraveling this over the next week or so, and then eventually I'll skein it up and we'll dye it. I'm going to be doing, I'm not going to join them all into mega skeins of the different colors, so I'm going to have 8 separate little skeins and do more of a color work type project with the finished yarn, I think. But it is quite soft and I'm looking forward to working with it. So yeah, I guess that's about it. You'll see more of these in the future, and since every sweater is kind of its own unique way of construction, usually I'll do some more deconstruction videos as I find more to unravel, because I do think that if this is something you want to do, it's useful to have that knowledge of how to approach the sweaters to take apart, because some of them are very odd. So yeah, that's about it. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.